Hey there, Mr. Terry back with another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, we're returning to Hakim with a video that I have been getting recommended and from you guys over on Discord. It's called "The Man Who Brought Down the Soviet Union Was a Terrible Human Being." The collapse of the Soviet Union is a very interesting and debatable topic. And of course, being from the West, most of the sources and interpretation I've heard about the Soviets' collapse comes from Western perspectives. So it'll be good to see Hakim's take and see what he thinks about it. All right, the original video is linked down below. Please support that. Give it a view, like, subscribe to the channel. And let's check this out. Sorry, I am in allergy mode right now. I look like I just came from hell or something, but I promise you I'm okay. Here we go. I'm on Means TV. What's up?
Hi there. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, for the uninitiated, was possibly the best-known anti-communist name at some point, till the West quietly discarded him. A guy known for some kooky...
Be a big reason why I haven't know much. That name I've kind of heard in passing, I think, but that's about it. So, good. Might learn a lot here.
beliefs, near entirely fabricated stories passed off as historical fact, and a deeply xenophobic nationalism that made him the talk of the town for the enlightened liberal West. This isn't the tale of a
xenophobic nationalist. Was he just very Russian? What, wanted to see the Soviet Union, break up so it could be more Russian?
hero. He's a monument to the West's desperation to promote anyone willing to oppose the USSR, no matter how strange or unsavory.
He's not wrong there. Anybody know Cold War history, CIA history? The United States will side with, and did side with, about anybody that was opposed to the Soviet Union. It didn't matter what your background were and how terrible you were. The U.S. sided with a bunch of guys I'm sure they maybe might second guess.
Who is he, and why was this guy first arrested? Class background is of course important. Born in 1918 to a family of rich landowners whose property was expropriated during the Russian Revolution, he lived a mostly uneventful life until World War II, where he was quite the unpleasant figure, mostly to Jewish people, according to even his own admirers. But in February 1940,
what did he say?
Figure mostly to Jewish people, according to even his own World War II, where he was quite the unpleasant figure, mostly to Jewish people, according to even his own admirers. But in February 1945, during a war for the existence of the USSR, he criticized the war leadership and mused on overthrowing the Soviet government. To quote an incredibly sympathetic source to him, Solzhenitsyn and another officer, after days of discussion, astonishingly drew up a program for change entitled Resolution No. 1. They argued that the Soviet regime stifled economic development, literature, culture, and everyday life. A new organization was needed to fight to put things right.
All right, this is definitely a criticism that you would see from, especially a pro-West perspective. If you had heard a Russian say this and say you were like the CIA, you would love this, because these are the things that, you know, Americans and Westerners want to prop up about the freedoms that we have, that of literature, culture, again, everyday life here, that's supposed to lead to economic development. Now, under the Stalin years, because that's what they're going to be talking about here, there was economic development. In fact, economically, they really transformed themselves into an industrial society, having lacked so much of that back before the revolution. But of course, there's criticisms of just how managed, I guess, that economy was. And from the West, hearing about this type of planned labor and planned economics is something to scoff at from Western capitalists for sure. But all right, I could see why this guy might be an ally of the West from the inside.
Some sources even state that he directly acted on it, but I can't get my hands on any of the letters he wrote, so I can't say that much exactly. He did, however, state, and I quote, "The German army could have liberated the Soviet Union from communism, but Hitler was too stupid and did not use this weapon." The weapon in question being counter-revolutionary organizations within the Soviet Union.
Well, even though, you know, Mr. Mustache Man hated communism and he was an anti-communist, that was never the goal of the invasion. It's Lebensraum. It has nothing about liberating the people from communism. He wanted to liberate the Germans from communism, but yeah, not the actual practicers over in Russia. That's Lebensraum. That's living space for future Germans to go to. So yeah, that was never in the cards. Mustache Man could have done a lot of things,
which Nazi Germany did use, as they did in France. Solzhenitsyn treated the failure of Nazi Germany to annex the Soviet Union as some kind of missed opportunity. The goal, though. Later investigations, and through his own glowing testament in his books, Solzhenitsyn also turned out to be an admirer of Andrei Vlasov, a notorious Nazi collaborator. Now, what do you call a guy who sympathizes with Nazi Germany, supports their war aims, and idolizes Nazi collaborators?
A traitor?
I'll leave that up to you. Anyways,
depends
this
on the perspective.
Led to his arrest.
A patriot for some, a traitor for others.
and being sent to a labor camp. This isn't controversial. He would have been arrested
Gulag?
no matter which country during wartime. This simple fact
Well,
of him plotting to overthrow the Soviet government
all
is
of them?
always conveniently hidden under the claim that he was arrested for calling Stalin mean or some other nonsense. Let's briefly talk about some of his other work before getting to his masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago, starting with his book One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. In it, Solzhenitsyn paints a picture of life inside the prison walls as more liberated than outside. Oh boy, what a caged little hero.
Jeez.
Just don't bring any Jewish
he
people
hates
around him.
Hakim hates this guy. Man, we're only 2.5 minutes in. Yeah, he is seething. And I could totally understand from, Hakim's perspective. This guy does seem like a total, not sellout, but yeah, I guess a traitor.
This silly narrative glosses over the historical and material realities of
Just so you know, you don't want to be in a gulag.
Despite significant hardship, the Soviet Union made immense strides in education, healthcare, and economic development. Of course, it doesn't mean it's perfect, but this stuff should be considered. His focus on his individual suffering, though, how liberal of him, overshadows the collective efforts of a society that made and was making immense developments, especially compared to what came before it.
Right.
I'm
a big proponent of. I had this conversation with Fat Electrician, right? He does so many things about, communism, and a lot of arguments he brings, of course, against it. And in our conversation, I was talking about how the most fair comparisons or fair analysis to make about regimes, communist regimes that sort of take over, or whether forcibly or democratically or anything like that, is to compare conditions under that regime to the ones before it. Not against other capitalist states or even other foreign communist states. It's about what was going on before that. So if you're in Soviet Union, it's like you're comparing it to life before the Soviet Union. So under the feudal czarist regime. If you're in Cuba, you're talking about under maybe the Batista regime. So that's the best comparison. That's something I think I've tried to advocate for because it brings in a more historical perspective. And that's really, I think, a good way to do this, and maybe the best way to do this. Now, you can do your parallel examinations about them of comparing states at the same time across borders, but like every country has its own experience, every people has their own experience and their own things, and I think we get into apples and oranges rather than comparing apples to apples.
Battled cancer ward, his character expresses a cynical liberal refrain that greed and corruption are immutable human traits, which totally abandons the possibility of societal change and ignores the actual sociological fact that people are products of and subject to their material conditions.
Sure.
Nobody is immutably anything. This is also the work based on his time in a prison camp where he was...
Are you immutably prone, though, to survival and whatever it is to survive, just from like a biological perspective, like an evolution perspective, and that ingrained in us is at least some sort of selfishness? Now, we may be irrational with our selfishness. That's true. I mean, we've seen one of the things that makes the human race be able to prosper, not just our intelligence, but also a fact of empathy that we have towards each other, and the fact that when you coexist and when you work together, you do better. You can actually even see this in like the animal kingdom. Look at wolves. They're in packs for a reason, and to be a member of the pack also comes with some expectations. If you are somebody in the pack that has like a wolf that has like stolen food or something like that, you are shunned by the pack. And then what happens to that wolf that's shunned by his pack? They don't survive out in the wild. I don't know. The nurture versus nature argument I still think is one to talk about, but I do very much believe that cooperation is something that has, even from a biological function, has been profitable to humans and animals alike that participate in that.
Was cured of his cancer, free of charge, by the Soviet healthcare system in a gulag. Non-imprisoned Americans can't even give birth in a hospital without financially ruining themselves, let alone get cancer treatment. You can't reconcile the evil, mean, bad police state is crushing us all with even his own sense of reality of what he experienced.
So I guess you're saying would it be better to have cancer in the Soviet Union then than in the United States?
Solzhenitsyn's writings, including the Gulag Archipelago, strip away any pretense of complexity, presenting the Soviet regime as cartoonishly or unreasonably evil.
Sure.
There's no effort to analyze why things happened. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Incogni.
No, there's plenty of
back, a
cartoonish
massive data
things that have
breach
been
involving
placed
the
on
National
the
Public
Soviet
Data
Union,
Company
which are
exposed
not
tons
true.
of personal information of
He's
millions
right
of
about
people
that.
to the public, including their social security numbers. MPD is a data aggregator that collects information from various sources without your knowledge or consent, which allows for massive breaches like this to happen should hackers be determined enough. This information being online for all to see exposes you to various dangers such as scams, identity theft, online harassment, and stalking. Data breaches can leak your name, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and more. Many data brokers sell this bulk data to companies, which may use it to target vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, to increase insurance rates, or other unpleasantries. Now, what can you do about this? Well, that's simple. You can use Incogni. Incogni contacts data brokers on your behalf, requests the removal of your personal data, and handles any objections they might have. Through an automated process, Incogni ensures your data stays off the market by making repeated removal requests. That's why Incogni's annual subscription is so valuable.
Protect
it
your
continuously
secrets.
protects your data privacy for as long as you're subscribed. For my viewers, you can get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan using the link below or with my code Hakim. How do you get started? First, create an account, grant Incogni the right to work for you by contacting data brokers on your behalf, and kick back as Incogni requests your personal data removal, handles any objections from data brokers, and keeps you updated on their progress every step of the way. So what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description, use the code Hakim, and get your 60% off an annual Incogni plan and start protecting your data today. Thanks to Incogni for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video.
Props to all the editors out there.
Let's move on to his supposed masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago. The Gulag Archipelago is considered a crown jewel of anti-communist work.
He seems like one of the guys that a lot of you are younger, but there's a good chance if you're older than me, and that in like if you were in like elementary school, say like in the 80s or something like that. I'm not that old, but like somebody older than me, that at some point in your education, young education, you might have heard from literally somebody that came from like the Soviet Union and like spoke to your school or your class about how, evil the Soviet Union was. Someone that maybe was in the Gulag or again, just escaped and talked about the horrors of it. That was a really big thing back in the day that was like very much accepted in education, that you brought that. It was just like state policy, of course, to, hate on the Soviet Union for the United States. And you can understand that if you know the history of the Cold War and all that. But yeah, this seems like one of those guys that would have been one of those guys that would go and go to the school assembly and talk about how bad the Soviet Union is. If you are somebody that ever had that growing up, like a speaker like that, let me know down below.
Up there with the Black Book of Communism, which adds Nazi dead on the Eastern Front as victims of communism. So yeah, that's the level of reliable we're talking here. On that note, check out my video on the topic here.
Death Toll of Capital. Ooh, I might need. I haven't seen this from his. I would be very interested in checking this out. The Death Toll of Capitalism.
Anyways, the Gulag.
Let me know if you want me to check that out next for the next Hakim video I watch. The Death Toll of Capitalism. I'd be very interested in that if you guys want to see it.
Gulag Archipelago is supposed to be an attack laying bare the terrible truth of the Soviet labor camp system. A system of rehabilitation through labor used throughout the world, including the West, up until the 1950s, when the USSR stopped using it as well. This system, however, is still used in other forms to this day in the United States through the existence of penal labor. Here's the catch.
What labor?
Used in other forms to this day in the United States through the existence of penal labor.
Oh, penal labor. Yeah.
Here's the catch.
Yeah, that's something that has been talked about, is using prisoners for labor. That was actually, I believe, here in this election 2024. Didn't California, wasn't that a ballot initiative to ban that? It was kind of framed as like slavery, essentially, but that criminals could be used for labor outside, I think, of the prisons. I think inside, I don't know if that was part of the ballot initiative, or like, a lot of inmates inside will be part of the people that like serve the food and do the laundry and stuff, but like outside doing labor. Was that something? Californians, let me know. I thought I remember hearing that was on the ballot, and I think it got voted down that like it is allowed. It was I think a bill to ban it.
Catch in regards to Solzhenitsyn's book, though, is based entirely on unverifiable anecdotes, wild exaggerations, and flimsy evidence. In essence, they're camp stories. Even his wife said so, stating, "The subject of the Gulag Archipelago is not in fact the life of the country, and not even the life of the camps, but the folklore of the camps." J.R. Getty, a celebrated historian and expert in the field, said his documentation is methodologically unacceptable in other fields of history, and that the work is of limited value, which is a nice way of saying it's bullshit.
So are we saying that there are people that exaggerate things for their own purpose, and that it is not like unique to any type of philosophy? I mean, that's just kind of everywhere. But yes, yep. Nothing new here.
Content on just describing the Gulag system, he took pains to twist and stretch meanings and words to paint the USSR as an evil monster from 1917 until its fall. And because all of it was pure propaganda, it was made to reach you at an emotional level, so you ignore the fact that he's talking nonsense.
Appeal to emotions.
Yet many still treat this borderline fictional memoir as a history book. Historians who have studied this work consider it a memoir, not a historical document.
What would be, I wonder what would be some examples if you'd say, like, let's say like Soviet analysis of the West and like descriptions of life in the United States. What would be some that would be probably common, using, again, fluffy languages and being very antagonistic and being very hyperbolic? What were those arguments for the Soviet Union towards the United States that were not true? I wonder if Hakim would, like to discuss those, if he's saying it's, very one-sided. Okay, that's fair. What would be some of those arguments, the hyperbolic ones, towards the West?
Gulag memoirs, like Solzhenitsyn's, offers no such documentation and provide readers no way to verify his claims. It's because memoirs and adjacent literature focus almost entirely on individual experiences, meaning stories, anecdotes, all of which are highly unreliable sources. Now, this doesn't mean that gulags were good or whatever you may have dreamt up, but an honest person approaches topics like this with nuance and evidence, something almost entirely missing from this work. Gulags existed. They weren't nice places to be. On the other hand, both by total amount of people and by percentage, the US prison industrial system is larger than the Gulag system at its peak. So why isn't the US considered an...
Is this... Whoa, look at that question mark. Do you guys consider this type of argument whataboutism? Where it's like you bring that up, about the conditions of gulags, but then the US prison system. You feel like anytime that's brought up right on the back of a criticism of, again, Soviet prison, do you find that to be whataboutism, that essentially fallacious argument?
An empire of evil. This is the kind of contextualization you need to actually understand things, but I'm getting carried away. Read Getty's work. The USSR's secrecy regarding the Gulag system was nearly airtight, so basic facts like how many people were in the Gulag were left to wild speculation, which unfortunately ended up serving Solzhenitsyn's interests, since it meant he could lie wildly.
Sure.
Even the scraps of data historians were left with were often unreliable, since they came from highly questionable sources. Solzhenitsyn tells horror stories from inside the camps, but never develops an analysis of why gulags exist or why he's interned, aside from generic authoritarian for authoritarian's sake nonsense. Why would he? The goal of his work isn't to provide a well-substantiated, accurate, and nuanced picture of the Gulag, or mention how the majority of his fellow inmates were embezzlers, corrupt officials, ethno-nationalists, rapists, violent criminals, etc., and not all gentle, songbird political criminals.
Right. That is largely, I will say, from the West perspective, sort of the idea about gulags and what they were was just like political opponents. People that were free of any real crimes. But gulags were multifaceted. They did have a lot of people. Yeah, sure, political opponents. I guess you would say potentially in the same way prisons might offer in the West if you are seen as, I don't know, somebody that seemed like a threat to the system.
Even according to the most anti-communist of sources. One perfect example, songbird political criminals, even according to the most anti-communist of sources. One perfect example of his dedication to creating anti-Soviet propaganda is his wildly exaggerated death toll numbers. As we all know, anti-communist propaganda loves inflating death tolls.
Yeah, the 100 million number. And it's just like, well, like the people that died. I've seen the argument with this because that 100 million number is out there. But like, what does it take in account? Is it directly due to intentional political deaths, I guess, but not, other types of deaths or something like that, or even imprisoning, that kind of thing. So. Yeah, I know there's a lot of numbers that do get kind of blown up when you talk about the deaths of, how many people communism killed. But then I know Hakim is brought up, and that maybe, again, I think it'd be really good for me to check out if you guys want to see it. It was like death toll of capitalism. And I wonder if we do end up looking at that video, if he is consistent in what he frames are the justifiable deaths as a result of communism and capitalism. I don't know if it's just from an economic perspective or also in tying with forms of government, if there's a consistency between the arguments, that if you're going to say, okay, if you're going to attribute to this many people death to communism, are using that same criteria for death to capitalism, death as a result of capitalism. I would hope that happens, that you have that consistency.
The millions of dead in the camps are absurd. But he wasn't alone. Robert Conquest, an intelligence officer employed in a dedicated anti-communist propaganda bureau, claimed that the Kolyma camps alone killed 3 million people, a number he pulled out of his ass and is literally mathematically impossible. He's essentially the popularizer of the vast majority of anti-Soviet myths, which he frequently did based on no evidence and in a way that wouldn't fly for any other historical research had it been not so ideologically convenient.
Sure. People will tend to believe statistics that already agree with preconceived notions. That's absolutely true. We see it all the time in everything, in politics, in science, in anything. It's how we're wired. We're wired to have our opinions validated. It's one of the things that brings us emotionally the most satisfaction, is having our ideas and beliefs validated.
So what is the truth? Well, the answer is simple. There was no mass death or extermination policy in the prison system. In fact, the central government, sadly not always in the know of all the conditions in every single prison in the massive country, pushed for better medical care and quickly punished Gulag officials if death rates spiked. And yes, people did tragically die after being released, and that is a valid criticism, but the outrageous numbers Solzhenitsyn and others throw around are childish.
Are the ratios of the deaths skewed based off of reasons why they're in the camps? That's one thing I would be interested to know, like political opponents again versus crimes. What other types of crimes, criminal activities?
When conditions in the camps got bad, the Soviets released the worst off prisoners early. Solzhenitsyn's logic is that, well, technically all the prisoners that were released eventually did die of something, so therefore the Gulag system killed them, which leads him to
figures up to 66 million.
However, scholars today have real data and a more accurate death toll, estimating a tiny fraction of what Solzhenitsyn claimed between 1930 and 1950, the most turbulent period of the country since the Civil War. Thanks to the series.
Now, wasn't also true that a lot of gulags, they kind of opened a lot of them to give reinforcements into World War II, that some of those soldiers had been sent out from the prison systems, basically put on the front lines and killed. That's something I have learned about, but I don't feel completely justified with the statistics of it. They're just arguments that I've heard, so I'll be honest. So you guys can help with that. What do we know about that? About prisoners basically being let out early for joining the war in World War II and likely dying, because again, 20 million people are going to die.
Archival research, we can now properly grapple with the actual grim reality of the Gulag and rightfully criticize it. It was horrific, but it wasn't the Nazi-style death camp Solzhenitsyn and his followers portrayed it as. This exaggerated, one-sided account of Soviet labor camps continued to shape Western perceptions of the USSR, due in large part to the CIA. This shouldn't be understated. Most of what you know about the USSR is probably the brainchild of directed, nefarious propaganda work by what essentially amounts to a terrorist organization that overthrows democratic governments for fruit company profits. The only
He's not wrong. By the way, do you guys know Jared Diamond, author of Guns, Germs, and Steel? I get those vibes. I don't know if it's like it's almost like this like Amish style like beard, except this guy's is longer when it comes out of the chin. I keep getting Jared Diamond vibes. Anyways.
The reason Solzhenitsyn is known, and that people at least pretend to have read the Gulag Archipelago or his other works, is because the CIA plastered it everywhere.
Yeah.
Pretty much like Orwell with Animal Farm in 1984.
Yep. I hope you all know with Orwell, okay, and Animal Farm, it's supposed to be like representation of like communist style or communist society. But most of you probably knew that, right?
The CIA treated the Gulag Archipelago like a holy book, using it as a tool in their crusade against the Soviet Union and promoting it in a propaganda operation in Europe aimed at influencing people and hating socialism and glorifying the American way of life.
Totally agree with Hakim here.
One of their most potent weapons was a front organization that funded and promoted anti-Soviet propaganda called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. They translated the Gulag.
I love the names. I love in the United States, the names of like committees and laws and legislation where you put such a nice title to it that really doesn't have a lot of descriptive value, but just to look at it obviously must mean, oh, well, I like cultural freedom, therefore anything in it must be very good here. All right, they're going with Oppenheimer here because there's J. Robert Oppenheimer in the left who absolutely got railroaded after he was seen as non-essential after World War II because he had some socialist sympathies in his life.
Archipelago into many languages almost immediately and promoted it and the lies within alongside with his other works. This wasn't some minor operation. On the surface, the CCF appeared to be funded by labor unions, but even most of its members were clueless about where the money was really coming from. The CIA would rope in prominent Western intellectuals like Arthur Koestler and Ignacio Solon to lend credibility to their cause. They published and heavily promoted books, organized conferences, handed out awards, all in the relentless pursuit of winning the culture front of the Cold War.
Yep.
Almost no post-war intellectual in Europe was
It's amazing how much of that cultural propaganda, whatever you want to call it, just went on for so long in during the Cold War. I mean, again, you had like McCarthyism and stuff in like the 50s, but then it's like in the Reagan era, you're in the 80s, and it's still just like going on. It was just like multiple generations of this for sure. Again, if you didn't know, yeah, they literally brought people from former Soviet countries into elementary schools and did assemblies where they would talk about how bad it was. The kids,
by the CIA's influence, whether they realized it or not. A relevant book on the topic is Who Paid the Piper? The CIA and the Cultural Cold War. So if Solzhenitsyn's work was mostly political musings and camp fairy tales, co-opted for propaganda purposes, what was the man behind the fairy tales like? After all, he was the liberal darling for decades.
What I would like to know when he's bringing him up, who was he influenced by? Right, these guys don't come out of nowhere.
Well, Solzhenitsyn wasn't subtle in his rejection of democracy to begin with. For him, democracy wasn't just impractical for Russia, it was dangerous. He argued that Western-style freedoms would lead to ethnic conflict and instability, and pushed for, and I'm not kidding, a Russia-first policy, like a proto-Trump. Solzhenitsyn believed that because Russians had suffered more than any other people, particularly in relation to World War II, that they should prioritize their national welfare above all else.
And that's, very much against, I mean, it's not surprising, you don't necessarily see somebody like that is going to be on that side of things. It's totally antithetical to communism, which is supposed to bring down not just socioeconomic barriers with social class, but national ties. It was supposed to unify people based on class rather than national identity and social standing. So being somebody that like the polar opposite of that would be to be an ultra nationalist, I guess you would say. It's the other side of that coin.
Even at the expense of global cooperation. He viewed the fight for welfare above all else, even at the expense of global cooperation.
Anti-globalist.
He viewed the fight for political freedoms, like voting rights, as distractions from the real battle against falsehoods, particularly what he called the big lie. I promise this esoteric-ass way of describing things is real. He thought they pulled attention away from the moral struggle, which he saw as more important. Democracy to him was moral relativism, and therefore lacked firm leadership and a strong moral compass to guide society. This strong moral compass for him was actually just Russian orthodoxy.
I was going to say, it's just like some Russian form of fascism.
Could offer.
Although if he's going to be ingraining himself with, I guess, Russian orthodoxy, a lot of fascists put sort of the state and the idea of the state, above religion. But some you can use it as a tool. Many people have done in the past.
For the stability democracy lacked, just Russian orthodoxy, which he thought could offer the stability democracy lacked. This leads Solzhenitsyn to argue that Russian authoritarianism, specifically of the Tsar's variety, wasn't all that bad actually, because at least it preserved moral order. This is ignoring that Tsar's law, particularly in the latter period, was secularized and based on the same relativism he condemned.
Well, the argument would be that there was the social structure of the whole feudal structure would be immoral with that way of having serfs who are basically semi-slaves with no type of social mobility whatsoever. Maybe morality amongst the people, but maybe not between classes. I don't know. I would think that'd be something they'd argue for.
Besides the moral compass pillar, his other major reason for rejecting democracy was that monarchy, and its brand of authoritarian rule, has been the historical norm, and as such should be the norm forever.
It's true.
The best argument, of course. We've always done this, so let's continue doing this.
Let's hear it. It's that part's true. I mean, it's not necessarily a great argument. I don't know if it's more like a causation versus correlation type of things. But yes, there have been a lot more successful monarchies than there have communist or democratic states.
In contrast, he viewed democracy as a fad that would quickly flare up and die out. He was the model arch-conservative, basically a monarchist. I'm reminding you, this guy was a liberal darling.
He's an old school conservative,
was a
not
golden
a
age representing
neocon.
A time when divine and temporal authority were in harmony. Nostalgia for a time generations behind him, and one that he never experienced. His ideal, a strict and arbitrary hierarchical authoritarian society rooted in traditional values, was essentially feudalism.
Yeah.
To him, the fall of Tsar Nicholas II and the end of autocratic rule was the beginning of Russia's moral decline. He hated egalitarianism, arguing that because everyone is good at different things, we can't have an egalitarian society, which is possibly the stupidest gripe you could have with the idea. This rejection of equality, unlike his relationship with Christian aesthetics and monarchy, was very much in line with his fashy fetish for order and conformity. This is as deep as he philosophizized, though. The how, what, and why, any sort of deeper political analysis, all of it is basically absent.
In my class, we were talking about the Enlightenment, so we was introducing the ideas of liberalism and conservatism. A lot of people can get kind of surprised when you look at what it meant to be. Again, you're talking about during the Enlightenment, but what it meant to be a conservative or a liberal in the Enlightenment sense. So if you're talking like 1700s, because like conservative, and it was originally referred to those people that would like support the monarchy, would support the old traditions and support the old institutions. And it was the liberals that were pro-democracy and wanted a change of the status quo, because that's what like conservatism was. You know, those ideas can change somewhat. It's just like, okay, what are you conserving? What is the status quo of wherever it is you live? Because being a conservative or liberal in one place doesn't necessarily mean the same thing at a different time and different place. Because again, it's like, what are you trying to be progressive towards and respond to that way? But also, what is it you're trying to preserve? So a lot of people might need to relook and look again if they are honestly a conservative or a liberal in the current sense, because it might not actually fit your beliefs.
All that was left, in reality, was apologism and admiration for Pinochet's Chile, Salazar's Portugal, and Franco's Spain. What a convenient set of pals for an anti-communist crusader. Solzhenitsyn was anti-Semitic too, to no one's surprise. And I don't mean, oh, he's anti-Semitic as a result of absorbing it from the background of a racist culture. No, he was one of those anti-Semites, the kind of guy that would be comfortable talking about how the Jews control the world, unironically, to a stranger at a party. This wasn't a minor flaw, it was a central pillar of his later work. As an example, in his book 200 Years Together, he didn't critique Bolshevism, he just blamed the Jews for the revolution and all of Russia's prior and subsequent ills.
Russia now agonizes under the power of Jewish terrorism. So I don't want to say some things because it gets demonetized, but the Bolshevik Revolution, which many in Russia viewed as blank-led efforts, had placed the blank element in positions of immense power, enforcing policies that were seen destructive of the fabric of Russian civilization or Russian society. The perceived dictatorships, not only political but cultural, as blank influence spread into key institutions, and terror in the form of arrests, executions, forced labor is attributed to the Jewish domination. The suffering endured by millions is now linked in the polar imagination of leaders who have come to symbolize this era of repression. Man, he would have found himself a lot closer to
in a 1974 letter,
the Mustache Man followers.
He even suggested that minority groups, especially Jews, should leave the USSR to save the Russian people and maintain Russia essentially as an ethno-state. This sentiment is what got him expelled from the USSR in 1974, following earlier support from Nikita Khrushchev's government to publish his works. Some dissident he was. Fred Hampton was brutally murdered in his bed by state-delivered assassins, but this guy got government support for his writing. He blamed Jews for their own persecution, attempted to connect Jews to Bolshevik commissars, and echoed the rhetoric of the Black Hundreds, the ultra-nationalist anti-Jewish groups from Tsarist Russia. This Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, that Jews created communism to control the world, is a Nazi idea that is still with us today, in its renamed form, cultural Marxism. Must be why Jordan Peterson wrote the foreword for the latest edition of the Gulag Archipelago, Reactionaries of a Feather. In the West, however, Solzhenitsyn's nationalism and racism were hidden and or overlooked by his liberal admirers, of which he had many, who were salivating at the opportunity to embrace absolutely anyone from the USSR critical of the Soviet Union, even a lying monarchist anti-Semite. A relevant side note, he was the only writer from the Soviet Union to pass apartheid's South Africa's racist and anti-communist censorship exam, and never once in his life uttered a word about apartheid.
He was pro-apartheid,
some crusader for freedom,
or complicit.
Solzhenitsyn's critiques of the Soviet system and Western liberalism were neither insightful or revolutionary. He vacillates between reactionary dreams of a romanticized past and his total failure to understand material history. His disdain for both systems was rooted in a fascist and monarchist desire to return to an era that never existed. Solzhenitsyn said Western culture had become cowardly and morally bankrupt while propping up himself as a moral authority, of course as any monarchist would. Individual rights in the West, he believed, actually weakened administrative power. In his view, society's problem wasn't the exploitation of the many by capitalists, but the lack of a strong and moral authority capable of enforcing its will on the masses. He said the West had too much comfort and that it was a biological disadvantage to have that much comfort. This was really just a call for austerity, which reactionaries love. His strange historical musings pin blame on the Renaissance as the historical turning point, where spiritual values were replaced by materialism, leading to the eventual fall of monarchy.
So it's like roots in secularism. There you go. Tennis court oath right there. Yeah. So he hated the French Revolution. He obviously hated the Russian Revolution. Yeah. He hated, I guess, the secular thoughts of anything coming out of the Renaissance. The dude was born like 600 years late.
If you read between the lines, he's actually identifying and personally finding issue with the kernels of capitalism and the eventual march of the ideology of liberal governance as a guarantee for capital and capitalist development. But he's too fucking stupid to reach the correct conclusion that this is the march of history due to developing productive forces, and just as monarchy and feudalism was superseded, so will capitalism. He instead falls back on advocating for a fantasy past with serfs and kings. He was absolutely convinced that the peasantry was the moral backbone of society, essentially just advocating for feudalism. Here's an interesting example.
I mean, I think you can advocate for that and not say it's feudalism that way.
I'm betting you won't guess.
Let me hear his argument again there.
He passed with serfs and kings. He was absolutely convinced that the peasantry was the moral backbone of society.
We can be the moral backbone without wanting to be a serf, though. You know what I mean?
Essentially just advocating for feudalism. Here's an interesting example that I'm betting you won't guess. He was highly critical of the rise of capitalist speculators. No, it wasn't a critique of capitalism itself. Instead, he criticized them because they were a symptom of the collapse of his beloved Russian autocracy. More people with wealth means less power for the king, or whatever strong moral ruler he thought up.
So his grievances with capitalism isn't like what kind of a society it'll create. It just means less power from the monarchy and more power to, again, just the common folks, the peasants, I guess. Divine right. This guy loves divine right.
He further argued that democracy was flawed because no king, essentially. He thought that if you're going to hold elections, they should focus on the moral authority of individual leaders rather than which political party or policies they represent. He doesn't seem to understand. He's just putting different labels on
Would that just put him in line with like Plato? Plato believed he should be led by philosopher kings. He just doesn't want, I guess this guy just doesn't want it to be woke.
System, the very thing he's trying to argue against, the critique of democracy. This critique of democracy implies, by his own logic, that the masses and peasants are simultaneously the unquestionable moral backbone of society, but that they're also incapable of self-governance and need to be led by a king or king-like figure. In the end, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's legacy is a sham built on contradictions and Cold War opportunism. He's celebrated as a champion for freedom, but pined for authoritarianism and promoted fascist views. His so-called masterpiece, the Gulag Archipelago, is riddled with exaggerations and inaccuracies.
Now, the one thing just bringing back to his title here, the man who brought down the Soviet Union was a terrible human being. I'm trying to hear what his argument is that this guy has responsibility in bringing down the Soviet Union. This has mostly just been about a guy from the Soviet Union that hated the Soviet Union, but I haven't necessarily seen a connection to a direct connection to his influence. I mean, he is saying the Gulag Archipelago was widely read probably by the CIA, but I don't know if this would have been necessary to do that. It's not like if they hadn't read this that the Americans would be like, oh, the Soviet Union is actually poggers. Like, I don't think that would be. This is just going to likely validate the opinions of the official position of the state of the United States, which is anti-communist.
The Western ruling classes didn't embrace him for his contributions to justice. They needed a puppet, no matter how flawed, so they could push incoherent anti-Soviet propaganda. The second the USSR was no more, he became problematic and was quickly quieted.
Yeah.
Solzhenitsyn should be remembered for being and promoting a reactionary, xenophobic
Dude has no allies.
His celebrated status is just undeserved is a testament to the power of propaganda.
Yeah.
There are better critics of the USSR.
Well, he would have been pushed aside in like the United States too. It's all about using it as a means to an end. You think this guy, the American government would look at this guy and be like, hey, United States, y'all are like woke and need to have like a monarchy and you need to establish that. Oh, your country doesn't have like official state religion. I guess you should be, I don't know, whatever he wants, because Orthodox Church, very small influence in the West. But he probably sees maybe more of the Orthodox Church just more as a tool than anything else. I don't know if it actually comes down to like the doctrines of it, but he's just trying to appeal to a previous time when he felt the society of Russia was built on the moral framework of Orthodox Christianity.
And you shouldn't have to resort to monarchist power of propaganda. There are better critics of the USSR, and you shouldn't have to resort to monarchist anti-Semites to rightfully criticize the Gulag system or the shortcomings of the USSR.
He's true. He's right, for sure.
That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help.
Awesome. Final thoughts. All right, guys, said plenty during the video, but go ahead and comment down below what you think. Usually the conversation when I watch Hakim videos that people will bring up is, are the arguments consistent that he usually has? It's usually, you know, something on the lines of capitalism and communism, right? And being somebody that's very kind of pro-socialist and has communist sympathies, you know, that's his point of view. That's, you know, what he advocates for. But yes, do you find that there were consistencies and things like this? Again, the video was titled "The Man Who Brought Down the Soviet Union Was a Terrible Human Being." I mean, this was largely like a hit piece. It didn't necessarily say as much about what this guy's influence was, but he definitely brought up arguments where he was hyperbolic, it seems like, in his criticism and analysis of the Soviet Union, and was also trying to, it looked like at the end, you can see what its big purposes was. Okay, like out in the West, y'all don't like communism, y'all didn't like the Soviet Union, but like this is not the guy you should be using as your like authority on the matter of criticism of the Soviet Union. And on that case, I think Hakim's totally right. And there's plenty of other things here that is not going to actually align with Western values, not modern ones. So I think there are some good points to be made there. But anyway, what do you think down below? By the way, if you want me to check out that video, I think it's a like death toll of capitalism. If that's something you want to see, you can let me know down below, or better yet, drop a link to that video on the Discord server in the video suggestions channel. If I see that dropped and people are like, yeah, watch that, I'll be far more likely to get to that sooner. All right, with that, we'll see y'all later.